Now, Somalia is experiencing hunger and starvation on a massive scale and has been battling a hunger crisis for around 5 years. Joining us on the show to talk about this and how it's almost a forgotten hunger crisis, TJ Grant from World Vision. TJ, thanks for joining us on the show.
Kia ora.
Hey, Kia ora, Di and Tom. Great to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, as we take a moment to look at the situation in Somalia and Africa, you've been on the grounds, TJ, in Somalia recently. So tell us perhaps about this trip and maybe what the situation is here that people are facing.
I think you set it up well, Di, talking about a forgotten crisis. Somalia is not necessarily one of those countries you would often see in the headlines. And the context is really challenging there. Conflict, drought, uh, in many ways is really challenging for children and families and people living there just trying to survive. So Somalia dealt with 5 years of successive droughts. And in 2022, 43,000 people died of hunger in Somalia, more than half of them children under the age of 5. And I say those statistics, they're shocking, and hardly even anybody knows about it.
Mm,
I'm sure it's
mm.
probably the first time you've heard of it. And so to go there and to see what's happening on the ground, to meet with refugee families, I flew through Mogadishu to a place called Dolo, and it's a humanitarian hub on the border with Ethiopia. And it's a bit of a safe zone there where humanitarian organizations like World Vision and others can do some operations. And in the past year, that little area went from 50,000 to 150,000 refugees. And so when visiting, I had a chance to connect and meet with dozens of people, some of whom have been there for some time, some who've just arrived. And while there is some really harrowing and desperate stories when you think about the challenges, also some amazing stories and amazing power of the human spirit. I mean, I'll tell you one story just to get started. Sitting with a mom. Her name was Hamdi, and she and her three children had just arrived maybe a week before I had gotten there. And so they'd set up the most basic little shelter with just some tarps and sticks that they had. And they were sitting there, and just can imagine sitting on the dust in front of this little simple shelter and hearing her story. And so Hamdi's story, at the age of 14, she's living in Somalia and she was married off as a child bride. And so at the age of 14, she's married to this older man. She's his fourth wife. She has two children. Conflict breaks out in Somalia, and so they have to flee. And she lived in refugee camps in Ethiopia for a number of years. While she was in the camps in Ethiopia, though, she became a health and nutrition volunteer. She got training, she got educated, and then she became somebody who would help educate and empower other moms around how to better take care of their children. She was actually getting some money from this from some of the organizations that were supporting her there. So, pretty neat story. Unfortunately, her husband didn't like her working out of the house, didn't want her to have the money on her own. And so you can imagine this young woman in that context and the courage. And she says no. And she leaves that man, leaves that really bad situation, sets up a different life for herself, gets remarried, has three new younger children of her own with her own family, and is doing reasonably okay there. And then this hunger crisis breaks out. The challenges break out in Ethiopia as well. And they have to flee back to Somalia. And so she flees back with her three younger children to Somalia, where I meet her in this homemade shelter at this refugee camp. And she's been through this totally harrowing experience. She's hoping to get on the roster where she can get 6 months of food assistance. So she can get 6 months of food assistance to survive and feed her family and kind of try and rebuild her life here back in Somalia. But she's got to wait to get registered. And so I said, Hamdi, how are you surviving now? And her older son from her previous marriage, who's helping take care of livestock somewhere in another area, sends her $80 every month, and that's how she's surviving. And so I remember asking Hamdi, like, how do you cope? What does life look like now? And this is this part that just challenged me and inspired me so much. After all of these things, Hamdi had this amazing perspective. She said, I'm still hopeful and optimistic. She said, if I can get some help, if I can get on this food roster, I have these health and nutrition skills. My children have never been malnourished. I will start a small business. I'll work to do some other things, educating other women. And I have hope for the future. And I was really kind of shocked by that. And I said, yeah, any normal person in my mind would not be looking at life that way. And I said, how can you have that perspective? And it was really interesting. She said, I have a brain, I have these life experiences. I know what's good for me. I know what's bad, and I choose the good. And
Wow.
so pretty powerful from someone coming from that place. And so for us to be able to come alongside someone like that, to be able to provide the basic food assistance that they need, to help support them through that struggle and give families and mothers like Hamdi the chance to get back on their feet and set up on the future. That's why we're there and doing the work in places like that.
So, TJ, let's talk about the work of World Vision and what you're doing in countries like Somalia and Somalia itself. What sort of things are you guys putting in place?
So in situations like Hamdi's for new refugees, one of the main things we do is we partner with the World Food Program and we provide food assistance. And so people will get food assistance or cash assistance to help them to sustain themselves when they're living in these refugee camps. They're just rebuilding their shelter. So that's helping to meet the basic needs. In the shelter, in the refugee camps, we would also support water systems and water infrastructure so people have clean water to drink. One of the neat things we were doing in Somalia, just another quick story, was also helping to set up farming for refugees and getting land available. So we set up irrigation. We worked with the local council to set aside some farming. And I met a refugee, a man named Nisho, who's in his 70s, and he'd been living there for about 7 years. He'd fled earlier, come to this area, brought his children and grandchildren, and as a newly arrived refugee, he had started working on this farm that World Vision had helped set up with the irrigation. And so he and some others tilled the land, planted, and set up this farming. And it was pretty amazing because he talked about how during these 5 years of drought, the produce that he was able to get from this farm is what was able to sustain him and his family and his children. So helping to support families like that one. Now, a little nuance to Nisho's story, which is really challenging, but I think, again, inspiring, is the month before I arrived in Somalia, after all these years of drought, they had the worst flooding, if you can believe it, that they've had in almost 100 years. And so homes were
Wow.
washed away. This farm was decimated. And Nisho described how this year he'd actually been growing and developing the farm. He'd borrowed about $500 to have further inputs and planting for his farm to really hope to get kind of great income from this and really move forward. And it essentially got washed away. And so when I met him, he and the other farmers were back and trying to retill the land and recover and kind of restore the land. And again, with Nisho, I asked him, like, my goodness, like you've got to feel like you've started from back to ground zero. You're kind of like I would assume with Hamdi in this hopeless situation. And again, he had this amazing perspective. He said, no, when we first got here, this was like there was nothing here. There was no farm, there was no irrigation. Now we can plant again, we can till the land again. Like, we're not giving up. We're going to keep moving forward. He was 70 years old.
Wow.
Guy and Tom, there's this quote I want to tell you that just has stuck with me when I think about these stories. Okay, I just tell you this quote. It's a quote about hope. Okay, and the quote goes like this: people speak of hope as if it's this delicate, ephemeral thing made of spider webs and whispers. It's not. Hope has dirt on her face, blood on her knuckles, the grit of cobblestones in her hair, and she just spat out a tooth as she rises again for another go. And when I think of Hamdi and when I think of Nisho, I think of that verse on hope. And I think of the partnership that we can have. These aren't like helpless, hopeless people. Their circumstances look like that. These are amazing people with amazing potential that are in some of the most difficult, challenging places you can imagine. And so we have the privilege, I feel, to hear these stories, to partner with people like this and meet the immediate needs that are going to help them, but also help to hopefully set them up for whatever God's got for them for their future.
Mm-hmm.
TJ Grant with us from World Vision and back from a recent trip to Somalia. And TJ, I guess I'm just aware of time as we come up to the news, and you know we've got these stories, but I guess as we come to a close, in terms of partnering, I mean, obviously, it just seems to me as you hear these stories, like, you know, the setbacks keep coming, but, you know, just holding on to this incredible perspective in the midst of this, people who are living there and dealing with it. So people can be a part of helping out, donating to the World Food Program, and the best way to do that through World Vision's website.
That's it. You got it exactly right, Tom. And I think that's a really helpful perspective. You know, biblically, our kind of foundation is that idea of everyone is our neighbor, whether they're across the street, across the country, or across the world. And so we are really calling, and we need Kiwis to partner with us to see the Nishos and the Hamdis as their neighbors, to go to worldvision.org.nz. And anything that you can provide can go a really long way to meeting those immediate needs and supporting amazing people like that. And you know, if they were here, they would be thanking you and Kiwis for their partnership. And we appreciate the partnership with Rhema and always the chance to talk with you guys. So thank you.
Thanks, TJ. worldvision.org.nz. Thanks again for being a part of the show. Thanks for joining us on Rhema. Now, if you found value in today's content, hit that like button. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to our channel with the subscribe button. This really helps us to continue to produce more quality content for you. And hey, if you'd like to stay updated and never miss any of our future videos, ring that notification bell as well. Don't forget to follow us on our other socials, which are in the description below. And until then, stay tuned.